What you're looking at is a satellite view of Africa at night. Now, as you can see, on the top left-hand corner, you've got the United Kingdom and areas of Europe, parts of Scandinavia, and then if you move to the right, you have Middle East and Asia. But look how dark Africa is. This is South Africa, and this is the rest of the continent. And I think this expands on the earlier point that Marius made about energy poverty in the continent. The truth of the matter is that in Africa, we have a population of 1.4 billion people. However, only 750 million people have access to electricity, meaning that the remaining people only have access totaling 650 million. So this is a huge issue, and this is taken from the World Economic Forum report of 2019. So what does that mean in terms of the key issues for Africa as a continent? The first issue is access to energy, right? The second issue is security of supply. Even in South Africa, a country that we consider to be very developed, we have issues of security of supply as evidenced by the recent load shedding that we've had with Eskom. The third issue is infrastructure deficit. Now, when I say this, I mean that not that we need to have huge, large build projects, but we need to have infrastructure that can support the needs of African citizens wherever they are. And the fourth issue is climate change. Going back to my earlier point about Eskom, the recent cyclone that we had in Mozambique impacted Corabasa, the hydro dam in Mozambique, and it wiped about 900 megawatts off the grid, which resulted in load shedding. So these are the four key issues for Africa as a continent. But I want to focus more time on how we find solutions, innovative solutions to these key issues. Sorry, keep going backwards. So what are these energy solutions made up of? I think they can be grouped into three major areas. The first one is improved efficiency and better integration of systems. I think this is very applicable to countries like South Africa, like Kenya, where there is an infrastructure in place, but we need to make it better. The second one is around improved infrastructure and greater generation. I think this is more applicable in countries that are still developing, like Rwanda and the like, where they need to accelerate and support the economic growth with large build projects. However, the bulk of our continent just need access to lighting, heat for cooking and sanitation. That is the real problem on the far right-hand side. I'm going to talk about two companies that have really, really led the way in terms of innovative solutions to try and address this problem. Innovation needs no permission. For me, innovation in terms of this particular challenge can be grouped into three major areas. The first thing we need to do is that we need to deregulate. Regulation is good when you're trying to create structure and format, but when you're in a situation whereby you need to create wide-scale access to a particular resource, you need to deregulate and allow the market to determine what the needs are. The second area, and Marius touched on this just now, is around distributed generation. I think that the days of large infrastructure build projects are over. We need to be looking at smart grids and areas or pockets of generation whereby we can provide widespread energy access to a large group of people at a relatively low cost. The last area is around having a diverse energy mix. As we know, we have an abundance of natural resources in our continent, from solar to wind to biomass and the like. And I think we need to harness that energy mix to ensure that we create access to energy for as many Africans as possible. The first company I'm going to talk about is Mkopa Solar. This is a company that was established about 8 years ago. And this company essentially provides a mobile payment solution. What they do is that they give you a solar panel, a meter, a light, and a charger, and they allow you to pay for that asset over a period of 12 months through some sort of asset financing, underpinned by the very successful M-Pesa financial product. And the idea is that after 12 months, you would have ownership of that particular product. Now, the amazing thing about this is that this was launched in Kenya and has now migrated to Uganda as well. But what they've managed to achieve is financing of 750,000 customers with asset financing of 233 million in just over 8 years. That's quite an amazing feat for a company that only started 8 years ago. On another note, I have the honor of advising the International Renewable Energy Agency. And what they're doing is that they've partnered with the Abu Dhabi Development Fund in order to drive energy generation in Africa, specifically by funding renewable energy projects. So what they're doing is that they're doing something very similar to what was done here in South Africa with Eskom and renewable energy, by actually allowing companies to bid for the opportunity to get funding for their projects. Now, the latest round of funding is pegged at $100 million, and it's the 7th round of bidding. And what's exciting about this is that the amount of innovation that I see when I evaluate these projects is absolutely astounding. I mean, there's one project where they're actually using floating solar panels in Mauritius, because Mauritius doesn't have a lot of land mass. So they're using floating solar panels to actually allow people to get access to solar in that country without having to, have large-scale projects that are built in that geography. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of energy in Africa, but I think we need to start looking inward and start creating our own solutions. The only, not disappointing, but the only challenge I think that we have is that a lot of the solutions that we have currently are coming from outside the continent. We're importing solutions instead of creating them ourselves, and I think that's the opportunity that exists for us. So, in conclusion, I think the solution is pegged around 4 main areas. I think the first one is around ease of access with no infrastructure. When I say no infrastructure, I think those 2 examples I've showed you illustrate that you don't need infrastructure to have power. You can do without it. The next one is around utilization of available natural resources, utilizing solar, wind, biomass, whatever is available to generate electricity. The second or the third one is around deregulation. And when I say deregulation, it's around the regulators of the energy industries actually allowing people to find their own solutions instead of holding them back from creating their own solutions. And the last point is about being quick and nimble, not large and slow. And I think this talks to the paper that Marius created last year about actually having utilities that are quick to adjust to the change of the environments that they're in, as opposed to only reacting when there are crises in their relevant markets or countries. And with that, I'll hand back to Marius. Thanks.
Thank you, Lelo. So with that as background, where does this leave Eskom and the like on the day when Moody's decides whether they're going to be moody or not? I think there are 4 major uncertainties facing the utilities, and we're going to get to the paradigm shift that we think governments need to make. First is, will the precarious fiscal position of utilities be resolved in ways that produce long-term sustainability, and will viable alternative funding models be created in the process? This is really driven by policy, model innovation, and the financial aspects of this. And of course, you'll see today, if we don't resolve that at the Eskom level, it has consequences at the national level, which has consequences at the regional level. And this is true across the continent. In many cases, they're in a similar position. The second one, will the low quality of governance in the sector be improved? And will this coincide with an appropriate regulatory response to Lelo's point around regulation that is enabling and facilitating of new opportunities in the sector? And this goes to the issue of political will. In many instances, it's not even that there are unions holding policymakers to ransom, but policymakers just don't have the impetus because of other vested interests in the way things are. And of course, that has impacts on the transformation, on the operational level around reskilling, retraining, and rethinking the capacity, the competencies of these institutions. The third big uncertainty is, will the private sector and other social actors, such as communities, consider partnership with utilities as an attractive prospect, or will they seek to take advantage of new avenues for energy provision in isolation? I think those examples are of the private sector bypassing government, going straight to communities, communities being vulnerable in some ways, but also having access to those micro opportunities. Will this be lifted up a level to a model that is more organized, more formalized? And that goes to the question of coordination and implementation. And critically, this issue of private-public partnerships, can they be thought through in a way that is beneficial to all the stakeholders? The next big uncertainty is around, and the final one, the wildcard scenario. Will climate change and its effects, such as extreme weather, persist, desist, or accelerate? And what will be the effects? There was a report this week that around 200 million people living in coastal cities will be displaced at a 3-degree climate change scenario. Half of those live in Africa. So you can start to get a picture of 100 million Africans moving, and the consequence of that on an infrastructure, security point of view, social cohesion point of view. Now, when you roll it up into a set of scenarios to try and understand the bigger picture, what you get to is 4 scenarios delineated around 2 big uncertainties. The big uncertainty around financial resilience. In other words, will there be financial resilience through a model of innovation and enabling policy? Or will there be burdensome finances? I think South Africa is the poster child currently for that, through unsustainable models and stifling policy. The second big uncertainty is, will there be synergistic collaboration between the public sector, the big institutions like Eskom on the continent, or will they act in an isolated and monopolistic way and really dominate that sector? Now, this is why I started with the point about the official future. When I presented this research to our counterparts at Eskom, the new board, it was clear that there is an official future in the minds of the decision makers in the energy sector. And in that official future, they are the big elephant. And the big elephant will continue to behave in the way the big elephant behaves. Now that produces a scenario that we've called the elephant herd scenario. You all know what happens when a big group of elephants come into an area and they overpopulate the area, they overgraze, and they push over the trees, and before long, because there's no trees, there's no grass, because there's no grass, there's soil erosion, and you see an overall degradation of the environment because of the dominance of those animals. We think that that's likely to happen if the utilities continue to behave in the way they behave. There is a second alternative, which is the white elephant scenario, where a combination of burdensome finances and monopolistic behavior takes these utilities down a road of constructing big infrastructure projects that are centralized, that try to produce sprawling power grids in a generally unstable, insecure environment. And we think this is likely to produce white elephants, because as we heard, many of Africa's cities are not planned, they're not coordinated, they're spontaneous, they're responsive, and in a climate change scenario, even more so, you might have a new city emerge between Abuja and Lagos in a climate change scenario, and the power utility might be under 50% of water. And so these raise big questions around those infrastructure builds. The third scenario is the hungry hyena scenario. You know what hyenas do? They don't produce anything, they don't hunt anything. They just scavenge, they look around for vulnerable prey and then take advantage, right? And so this is a scenario where a combination of burdensome finances with energy utilities that try to partner the private sector and communities, but do so in a way that really destroys value rather than creates value. They partner with communities carry the burden of taking the loans, and at the end of the day, the community ends up with old infrastructure that's inadequate, poorly maintained, and they've been taken for a ride through utilities that act in that way, an extractive way. We think the best case scenario is a Lions of Africa scenario, where there's a combination of this fiscal resilience with synergistic collaboration with the private sector and communities. And I like that comment about the community level, because there are these uniquenesses at the local level, and we think there's a massive opportunity. Probably the biggest industrial opportunity in Africa is around energy in the next 30 to 50 years. Now, into this environment comes climate change, biggest systemic risk. In each of these scenarios, climate change is a very different impact. In the white elephant scenario, there's a huge level of climate exposure. Power utilities, as we heard from that example, being undermined by extreme weather, high rainfall, drought, etc., undermining water provision, water security, which is needed in the energy sector. In the elephant herd scenario, you take a gamble. With extreme weather going our way, we're not being affected, we can get away with it, but you might find extreme weather completely collapses a grid, takes 2 or 3 weeks to get back online. Similarly, a climate make or break scenario with the hungry hyenas, we do think that a decentralization of energy provision and production using renewable energy will be the best way to mitigate the climate risk and create a mitigation and response environment. Now, I want to finish on this slide because I think it's indicative. When I share this information with a lot of policymakers, they say, well, you know, renewable energy maybe in 30, 50 years. But there's some lessons from the rest of the fourth and third industrial revolution, which is that it took 110 years for the telephone to reach 1 billion people. But it only took 49 years for the television to reach 1 billion people. It took 22 years for the mobile phone to reach 1 billion people, and it took 8 years for Facebook and smartphones to reach 1 billion people. So the challenge of Africa's energy environment, of 1 billion people without energy in the next 10 years, is not something that's unaddressable in a context where the technology is able to penetrate and proliferate at the rate that it can.